Welcome back to another episode of the How to Home podcast. This week we sit down with Tess and Baba from Epic Renewal, and we dive into why you should be composting, some tips for how to make a more sustainable lifestyle, and why we're nerding out about microorganisms. Welcome back to another episode of the How to Home podcast. My name is Aaron Massey, alongside Tracy Pendergast, as always. And our guests today are Tess and Baba from Epic Renewal, and we are talking about some composting tips and tips to create a more sustainable home. So thank you guys so much for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Why don't you give us a little bit of a background on Epic Renewal, what caused you to start it, and what the goal of it is?
So Epic Renewal, we are a curbside composting company out here in Los Angeles. And what drove us to start this is really that when we moved out to Los Angeles, there was no access for us to even have a recycling bin, let alone a composting bin. And we're from the East Coast, and we had access to a backyard pile, being able to compost ourselves, or another curbside composting company. There's a bunch of them out there, and LA just didn't have that. So we thought to ourselves, how can we start composting with the little amount of space that we have? We didn't have a yard. We barely even had a second bedroom that was kind of doubling as our office. And we wanted to figure out how we could just take our organic waste and really transform it without sending it to a landfill. And that just got us going on this.
So it's all about urban composting, really. It's about maximizing your space and finding ways to compost, which I guess is a traditionally rural kind of thing. You need the space, you need the environment. So this allows you to do it in any size space or any home?
Yeah, traditionally composting is a much more rural, farm-based practice. The urban environment was not meant for throwing your food waste out the window and just letting it decay.
Yeah, people don't like that usually.
No, people don't
you
like
just
that.
Throw a banana peel out the window and smack them in the face as they walk by.
Yeah, the old bucket method,
Yeah.
right out your window there.
Yeah.
Not too ideal in a bigger city.
But that also doesn't mean there aren't solutions for here, which is really what we're committed to figuring out and working on and finding a way to work with the environment we have and create a more sustainable solution.
No excuses.
Exactly.
You can do it.
That's right.
We want to make it easy.
Well, cool. Before we dive into all the benefits and all that type of stuff, we want to get some more information from you guys. But before we do that, we just want to take a quick minute to remind you guys to be sure to hit us up on social media with your questions or your comments at howtohome_guide. And we want to take a quick second to thank our founding partner of the How to Home podcast, which is FilterBuy. FilterBuy is an HVAC filter provider, and they can create any custom size or standard size filter that you need, and they ship them direct to your door at any interval that you want. I have mine set for delivery every 3 months. They show up to my door, I can install them, it takes 5 minutes.
Yeah, they're amazing. There's over 600 sizes, and you save 5% when you subscribe, and all orders are shipped free within 24 hours.
Yeah.
We love them.
So we thank FilterBuy for making this this episode possible. And let's just dive into some composting stuff. We've got a bunch of questions for you guys. First of all, I'm curious, what are the benefits of composting? Why should I do it?
Oh, this is definitely a Tess question. Tess is the compost and soil expert
She's ready.
here.
She's
Oh, yeah.
like, let's
Hit
go.
me. Hit me with
start
it.
over a couple times. I'm sorry.
That's all right.
So there's a couple local benefits, which a huge one is shrinking your waste hauling footprint. Most people don't realize how far their garbage trucks are actually traveling to get to landfills. So by finding a local solution and dealing with your food waste, you're actually reducing about 60% of your trash that is normally going to a landfill.
I didn't even think about that.
Like all the gas and
Yeah,
everything that the trucks
that's
are
something
using to
I've
haul
never
your
even
stuff?
thought about.
That's a huge part.
Okay.
So you're reducing those trucks on the road to begin with, and you're reducing what's going in your black bin every week. So that's the biggest part, at least from like a local level. Supporting your local composters or doing it yourself, you're also creating local self-reliance and local jobs. From a macro level, and I get like super excited about this, and I'm sorry. I'm just
I
gonna,
love your excitement.
Composting supports soil health. So finished compost actually works like a booster shot to soils. And what's super exciting about soil health is it actually creates all of these huge macro solutions to climate change and a lot of the challenges we're facing with our environment. So what's really fascinating is we can look at this huge picture that's really almost debilitating and we feel really helpless, but by simply looking down and taking care of the dirt and the ground underneath us, we can do a lot to actually be reversing our own impact. What people might not think about when they're throwing out their food scraps is food waste that goes into landfill. It actually is being deprived of the oxygen it needs to break down correctly. And as a result, it's releasing methane. And that methane is 23 times more potent than carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas. So it's super impactful actually when you look from an emissions perspective. perspective. And it's really easy to not think about because we think about trash and it goes away. And in reality, it's actually super impactful. And just by changing little habits in our kitchen and our home, we can totally be reducing that impact.
Yeah, and I think that's what the discrepancy is. Like, if it can biodegrade in my own yard, why does it matter if it goes in the trash? Either way, it's disappearing. That's kind of like the thought, right? So that's not really the case. There is a big difference.
There's a huge difference. And just by, for instance, doing it in your backyard, you're giving it the more natural systems it needs to be doing it the right way. And when you're letting food and organic matter break down the right way, it actually is doing all of this incredible magical stuff just by using the natural systems it's supposed to have. When we throw it in a landfill, it's totally deprived of the conditions it needs to break down correctly.
So what are some types of things you can compost?
If you're composting at home, that can be a little different than what, say, an industrial composter can do, or someone who can process on an industrial level.
Okay.
In your backyard, you'd want to avoid things that might contain pathogens. So you wouldn't want to try and compost meat or leftovers for other reasons. But yeah, you really want to keep that down to vegetables, fruits, yard waste, things like that. You might have heard greens and browns. Those are different inputs, mainly carbon and nitrogen based. But you find a good recipe for those and you can really get your backyard pile cooking.
And I'm sure there's tons of resources online for what you can compost and what you should avoid. And
From what I'm hearing you guys saying, it sounds like you have a very scientific background. Did you guys go to school for this, or how did you get into this? What ended up becoming your business?
The simple answer to your question is no, not at all. No science background. I actually have a psychology background. Tess is more of how would you describe your background?
I went to art school and studied product design. I spent a lot of time focusing on furniture and woodworking, creating pieces that you want to stay in your home and live a long life. But I also spent a big chunk of that time really focusing on systems and processes that make the world better. And in doing so, kind of really realized that big issue that matters a lot to me is like food packaging and the stuff that we waste on a regular basis, and how design can really solve for our habits and our systems that make it really easy to just waste and not think about what you're using, which kind of just drew us into this world, and we started kind of falling down this rabbit hole.
so this is passion right here. This is educating yourselves and then educating others because you have a legitimate concern and care for the environment. It's not really more from like a business standpoint first, right?
Certainly, yeah. It's not from a business standpoint first. And I think a good takeaway from this is that we don't have a background in this. We have, maybe a bit of a maker personality, but anyone can start composting. Anyone can get involved in it. And if you are willing to learn, you can absolutely get out there and there's a massive base of information to learn from.
And what I love about your company is if you're not willing to learn, if you're not the kind of person that likes to research and figure things out and do them yourself, there are companies accessible to you, like you guys, that will basically do the work for you.
Yeah, we want to make it easier for everyone to be able to do the right thing. And composting is one of those common sense right things to do. There's a lot of other companies out there like ours, some on a municipal level, some on a small community level. But yeah, there's a lot of people trying to make it easier to do the right thing.
So tell the listeners how your company operates, or what it is that you do on a day-to-day basis. You deliver a bin to them, correct?
Yeah, our basic residential model is we'll give you a clean container where you'll load all of your organic waste into, and then once a week, same as your municipal trash service, we'll collect that container, except we just give you a clean one to use again for the next week and continue on in that fashion. And then we take all of the food waste and process it ourselves into compost.
So for people that are concerned, my house is going to smell. Let's start there. Does your house smell with this bucket in your home?
No, it does not at all. As long as you close the lid, you're usually fine. It would be the same as if you accidentally left some leftovers in your Tupperware out on the counter. Until you open it up and it's been sitting in the sun for a long time, or, the dog got into it or something like that, you're not going to notice those smells.
But there's also a lot of like kitchen-based habits you can start building to really like avoid smells to begin with. It really depends kind of what you're collecting your stuff in, how often you're taking it out. For us, for instance, our containers are totally airtight, so it's totally contained. But if you're doing your own backyard solution, you might consider like freezing stuff in the freezer if you know it's going to be smelly, and then when you're about to take it outside, taking it out of the freezer. So there's a lot of like little tips and habits you can pick up that makes it a lot easier to do it in your home without it being impactful.
The model that you're talking about where the containers delivered to me, and then you come and pick up that stuff. It's not like you don't come back and deliver like processed soil or something like that at the end of it, right? You're taking it, just keeping it away from somebody else's, from a landfill, or essentially. You're not re-delivering the finished product in that case, right?
Mostly. We do offer a residential give back. So if people want compost and you want to add that to their garden, we do that once a year. But most people who aren't able to compost also don't have the need for finished compost. So we do find other good uses for that, such as urban agriculture or green spaces locally.
And there are a lot of other composters, our scale and municipal composting programs that do give compost back to home gardeners and people like that that'll make good use of it too.
So what I'm learning is there are different types of composting. So the method that you're talking about, which you guys do when it's in the barrel, what is that called?
That's called Bokashi Composting, which technically is not composting. Composting is defined as an aerobic process, which means you need to have oxygen involved. Our process starts out anaerobically, so we keep everything contained and introduce it to a beneficial culture of bacteria, which help to break it down a lot faster and without smells, which makes it a lot more suited for the urban environment that we're processing in. That's not the method for everyone, but if you're limited on space, limited on outdoor footprint, it could be a great solution for you.
Where does the term Bokashi composting, where does that come from?
Bokashi is a Japanese word. And the Bokashi composting process came from a gentleman, Dr. Higa, who did a lot of work in the 80s with this culture of bacteria, and through almost fault found that introducing this bacteria to certain environments produced these great results. And it's been expanding ever since then. The name Bokashi itself, I'm not entirely positive where it came from, but the Dr. Higa would be the origins of it.
So it really works like pickling or making kombucha at home. It's really just about letting bacteria do its thing and basically ferment the food with scraps so that it breaks down a lot faster. And it all can happen in a closed container.
And it'll actually have a really interesting smell at the end, similar to a stinky cheese or a stinky beer. It's kind of cool.
The things that we love the smell of as we grow older.
Stinky beer. Your process works without oxygen, kind of like what you were saying before, essentially. But it's because of the bacteria that it doesn't create that harmful methane situation that you were talking about?
Our process is a bit of a two-step process. So we'll use the anaerobic bacteria to pre-process everything, and then that allows us to have an aerobic finishing process to really turn that material into what's commonly seen as compost. So it looks like that finished soil, has that same texture to it, but really you could take anaerobically processed Bokashi composted material and add that right to your garden if you wanted to.
Someone's listening right now and really wanting to start to compost and has the space to do it on their own. Where do you start with figuring out what's the right method for you?
So we typically would ask people to ask yourself a few questions. How much space do you have? How fast do you want to have your finished compost in? And then how much money are you able to put towards this problem? There are home tumbling composting systems. Small investment can range from $50 up to $500, where you load your scraps into there and you're turning it manually by hand. You can have finished compost in about 2 months with that, given the right conditions. If you don't feel you have a lot of energy, you really want to keep it simple as possible, low investment, you could literally just make a pile outside and it will decompose over time. That's not necessarily going to be your healthiest pile, but it's keeping it out of a landfill better than the alternative. So really, it's a matter of where you want to start and what you're willing to put into it. There's a lot of great options out there depending on the variables you have to add to it.
It will be finished. That means you can remove it from the container and just put it into your soil and start to plant in it?
With the home tumblers and home systems, yes.
Okay.
And you'll visibly see the difference at that point as well.
You were saying you have one.
I do have, I have one of those big tumbler ones like what you're talking about. I bought it on Amazon, I don't know, a couple years ago. The only drawback that I can see from it is like because of how hot and typical summer months and stuff here, you have to keep it moist. You got to kind of maintain it and keep it in optimal conditions to break down. And it can become a little hard or time consuming. You just got to be out there constantly kind of monitoring that, which is a little challenging depending on how much time you have. But I think, if you have one of the more open type of piles, you still have to do the same thing, but I think the tumbler thing is kind of out of sight, out of mind, in my opinion.
In reality, when you're kind of playing with whatever makes the most sense in your home, it's really about striking a balance between those different variables of how much time you're able to put in, how much attention. If you really think about it like a recipe instead of like your waste, it becomes a little more approachable. Like, it's really about balancing what fresh materials you're putting in, what yard waste you're putting in, how much water you're putting in. And it is work. It is a learning curve.
It's a habit thing, though, like, right?
Totally.
Because like we're very habitual people, so that the traditional mindset is you're in the kitchen, you're doing your thing, you get all these offcuts and everything else on a cutting board, for example, and you just kind of toss it in the trash because it's just right there. But I think if you are shifting your habits and you start kind of just putting it into a container like what you're talking about, or something other than the trash can, eventually you get used to doing that, right? So it's about changing your lifestyle, changing your habits, that kind of thing.
Sure, and a simple habit change that you could do in the kitchen, just starting with your food scraps, even if you still have to throw in the trash can. When you're preparing food, scrape that into a bowl on the counter. Start to build that little habit that will help to make the bigger change. Because then when you have that full bowl of scraps, oh, I don't need to put this in the trash can. I can put this in my compost bin instead. And you've already made that difference.
We just live in the age of easy and immediate, and I can order something from the grocery store. It will be at my house in 2 hours, and having things already packaged, already chopped, and we're having to like relearn these things all over again and start to be mindful. And are you seeing people get more re-energized again about all of this?
Definitely. The whole sustainable community is really starting to take off now. There's a lot of zero waste, more sustainable living, blogs, social media people out there. And the general trend is certainly going there, away from disposables towards more reusables, less impactful on the environment. We're definitely noticing that trend as we continue to exist in the community, yeah.
One of the things I think people tend to think of with composting, in addition to the smells, is obviously like the pest or the rodent situation. Can you talk a little bit about that? How do you avoid that? Is it a misconception?
A lot of that is how you're composting. So for instance, doing like Bokashi, like we do, it's entirely in closed containers and none of that stuff ever becomes an issue. If you're, for instance, just doing like chicken wire in your backyard and turning stuff yourself all the time, it becomes a little more of an issue. But in reality, if you're spending that little bit of extra effort and trying to learn and improve as you go, and you're balancing your pile right, it won't smell and it actually won't attract pests. So all of those myths are actually, if they're happening, they're indicators that you need to adjust your process.
So in the backyard kind of, chicken wire situation that we're talking about, you usually want to kind of mill it up and mix it with already decent soil, right? Or some kind of dirt, put a layer of dirt on top of it kind of thing?
You want to be mixing it with dry brown material from your backyard. So that might be grass clippings, that might be leaves, that might be branches. It's a little less mandatory that it be soil, but it's important that it be stuff that isn't fresh and juicy and smells good. It's more the stuff that's dry and absorbs and balances it back out.
So what about the concern about safety, about planting in this? I mean, is there any reason to be worried about essentially eating vegetables that were grown in your trash?
Well, if you think about it this way, you're eating vegetables that were grown from your last vegetables.
Right.
So it's totally natural if you're putting the right stuff into your compost pile. The only really big concern about planting in this, and compost should always be mixed with soil. It's a soil amendment, so it adds and bolsters and strengthens your soil and makes it better for your plants. The only really big concern in terms of planting in it is if you're putting plants that were treated with pesticides in, those pesticides will make it through the whole process and they'll follow through to the compost, which basically means they'll continue to kill stuff in your finished compost. So it's just important to be mindful about really only putting like healthy, good stuff into your compost pile and being careful not to put in herbicides, pesticides, other toxic things that might just follow through to the end.
And then there is one other thing that could potentially be hazardous, and that's why you keep the meats out of your compost. The big difference between your backyard composting and your industrial composting is the temperature that pile is able to get to. So when you cross a certain temperature, that kills the pathogens in the compost. So those larger sites are able to break down and mitigate the damage that those could do. So as long as you're keeping meats and other potentially pathogen...
like eggs, stuff like that?
Think about it like the way you think about cooking. You don't necessarily want to eat a raw steak.
Right.
So you don't want to be putting stuff that needs to be cooked into your pile because it's not going to get cooked the way it needs to for it to be healthy in the final product. So the same things that'll give you a stomach bug will follow straight through.
What about like animal waste too, right? You don't want to put any of that type of stuff in
You
there.
don't. And it's a little different if you're looking at like industrial scale where they're working in like huge piles that are like the size of your house and they're getting super hot and all that stuff's cooking. In your backyard pile, you want to keep anything that's even iffy like that out.
What about Doritos? I'm just kidding.
Why would you throw away Doritos?
Who doesn't finish the Doritos?
Yeah, you finish the bag. What are you talking about? Who has Dorito waste left over?
That is a really good point. Always one step ahead.
I'm turning the thing inside out and licking the inside of the bag. Let's talk about, so somebody wants to get into composting and more sustainable habits. Like where's the best place to look in your opinion? You know, you guys are obviously well-versed on this. Are there any good sources of information that people should definitely look into?
I mean, the internet's is a great starting place. There's also a lot of great books out there.
Actually, the US EPA's page on composting is a super helpful starting point. And then if you start finding things you're really curious about, those are kind of the questions to start looking elsewhere for. But I would definitely start at their page. It's like a great overview.
Local community type pages too, where you can actually talk to people in your area, maybe might be helpful.
Yeah, and so I know we have access to a lot of this stuff here, but in a lot of cities and other rural areas, there are community gardens, there are municipal programming that are happy to teach you and help you. So getting involved in a community garden or looking into composting workshops or educational opportunities, master gardeners and people who have been doing this forever are always really excited to share.
So let's say our listeners are living in kind of an urban environment and they hear your business model that, you know, somebody will deliver a bin to them. How do they search for that, you know, to see if there's somebody like you in their area?
So there are several different options. We obviously, we encourage starting with your city and your local community gardens and stuff like that. If you don't have those options available to you, because a lot of community gardens and farmers market have compost drop-offs, and those tend to be free, which is an awesome starting place, the easiest, lowest cost, most accessible option. If you're looking for someone like us, that is more of a concierge service and makes it super, super easy. If you don't have time to get to the market, you don't have time to be dealing with this. I strongly recommend Compost Now's website. They have a really good database of people like us. So community scale composters who are small, serve residentials, do pick up and drop off. They have a really accurate list of all of that stuff.
And there's really about one of our organization in every major city. So they're really around all over the states, especially international, but definitely all over the states.
Yeah, there's over 100 organizations like ours that do this in most major places, and that's not limited to cities.
In your process, in the Bokashi style, so I have the container, I'm throwing food waste in there. Do I have to stop throwing food waste in there at a certain point and then shift to another container so that stuff can continually break down? Or how does that work?
Yes. So once you've filled up your container, you want to let that sit closed for a week or two, and then you're good to dump that out and start it again. If you're going to fill up an entire container in that 2-week period, then sure, switch over to a new one. In the meantime, you could also freeze your scraps until your bin is empty, and you can start reloading it again. You have a container. You take your food scraps in about 1 or 2 layers. You add those food scraps in, and then add a small sprinkling of Bokashi bran or an inoculated brand of some sort with that bacteria. And there's a few options depending on where you are. In the States, wheat bran's the main one to use because that's just so plentiful. In Asian countries, rice bran's a little cheaper. You could even use newspaper if you had a shredder or something like that.
Farmers market drop-offs and community composters like us, they'll just take your food scraps as they are and you don't have to do anything. And they'll do all of the work at the end.
When you talk about this bacteria, do I have to go buy something specific for that? Or is it just random stuff that you're talking about? You mentioned, what was it, wheat?
Wheat bran. Sure, there's a few different ways you could approach that. If you wanted to just have this brand pre-made, there's plenty of groups out there who produce the inoculated wheat bran and sell it out. We are one of those groups. If you want to do everything yourself and make it at home, it's actually quite simple. What you need to do is purchase EM mother culture. There's 2 companies in the States that really make it, ProBio and Terragenics. And then you take that mother culture, mix it with molasses, water, and wheat bran, and then you let it sit for a week or 2 to really inoculate in that wheat bran, and you're good to go. You have your composting material there.
Sounds very scientific.
Yeah, so for someone, again, that listens to all of this and is like, dude, I don't have time to do this. I don't want to spend money to throw away my trash when I could just throw away my trash for free.
You got to pay for your trash service.
No,
anyway,
but I'm saying for the people that just aren't motivated to put in the work, like what do you say to them? Like what would be your
selling point?
Your selling point, yeah.
If they're not trying to make a difference in the environment, it's going to be a tough sell. But that's usually how we open. It's that you can make a difference in your environmental impact. You can start to counter climate change through your practices. That's really the best way in, is you have the power through your own actions to create that change and that impact.
Yeah, I think it's just being mindful that there's so many options out there to deal with it, and they don't all require spending an hour outside every day. They don't all require spending a certain amount of money for a pickup service. They might just require you bringing a bag of your food scraps to the farmer's market with you when you go. So I'd really just explore what options are available to you, and especially where you live, and figuring out what makes the most sense for you. I know our work and the people who do work like us, we're really dedicated to making it really easy and intuitive. But it's really about what fits with your life and what you have the space and time and means to do.
So beyond the landfill issue, what are some bigger environmental impacts of composting?
Well, so the finished product of compost, it acts as a soil amendment, and it's really functioning like a booster shot to soil. So what most people don't know is just in a teaspoon of healthy soil, there are more microorganisms than there are people on Earth. Which is just super
she gets
cool.
really excited about this.
Yeah. And all of those microorganisms, when they're in the soil and the soil is super healthy, it's working in tandem with plants to make our planet better. So it leads to this like myriad of really exciting impacts, like the first of which, when those plants and soil are working together, they're actively taking atmospheric carbon down, where it's acting as a greenhouse gas in the atmosphere, and they're pulling it down and storing it in soil, where it acts as a life builder and it builds plants and other material. That saved carbon in soil, when it rains, it functions like a sponge, and suddenly the ground can absorb that water and store it and replenish our water tables, which leads to drought resistance. On top of that, that carbon's functioning exactly like your water pitcher in your kitchen with a carbon filter. It's pulling heavy metals and toxins out of the water and leaving pure water behind. With the same amount of soil that's healthy, you can be growing a significantly more abundant yield of plants. So we can be growing more crops in the same amount of space. When they're working with all those microorganisms in soil who are literally doing all the work for them and delivering nutrients to them, those plants are more nutritious and healthier, which makes a huge difference when they end up on our plate. So we're getting more nutritious food, and we're getting more of it with the same amount of input. Those microorganisms are also reducing our reliance on pesticides, herbicides, and toxic fertilizers, which means that farmers can spend less money growing healthier and more food. And that means as customers, we can spend less money on that food and be feeding our family healthier food. Finally, those healthy soils, the last thing, I swear, those healthy soils, they promote biodiversity in the ecosystem. And the more diverse our ecosystem is, the more resilient it is to change and other impacts. So as we're increasing that biodiversity, we're improving our ecosystem and its ability to take care of us and deliver the services that we rely on but don't really think about. So the food it's giving us, the water it's giving us, the climate regulation, and the air that we breathe. So like on the whole, like what's super exciting about composting is most of us aren't farmers. We're not growing our own food. We can't necessarily change our agricultural practices, but we can take, the cutoff from your carrot in the kitchen and be building a healthier planet as a result of it, instead of letting this kind of thing we've looked at as waste that's really an opportunity go to a landfill and do damage. We can actually be healing with it instead, which to me is just super exciting.
So do you guys do a lot like your own home gardening as well? Because you have access to all this compost and stuff now.
We do. We have a few raised beds at our place. We're renters still out here, so we added in some raised beds for our own personal gardening purposes, and there's also a few fruit trees that we've added our compost to, and we've been seeing some great results out of that.
So obviously you guys are passionate about the environment. You have a business based entirely on kind of helping minimize the impact on the environment. So are there other sustainable habits that you can recommend, or other things that you guys do personally that carry over from your business into your day-to-day life?
Oh, absolutely. And really, once you start diving into this world, it's a rabbit hole. You keep finding new ways that you can make less impact. So even something as simple as bringing a to-go coffee container with you, when you go into for your morning coffee stop and not getting that one cup. That's a great step. You saw the straw movement that came about recently. It's not just the straws. It's all of those disposable items and disposable plastics that are ending up places. That's a great one that a lot of people are drawn to very quickly. There's the myriad of ways you can reduce your impact though, from cooking at home more, eating out less, carpooling, optimizing your routes for errands, really any number of ways. If you would like to make a change, there's probably something in your life that you could start to alter slowly or start to build that habit towards and incorporate that practice into your life.
I know some of the places we've started have been, like Baba said, starting to just swap out the staples of our everyday life with stuff that we can reuse. So like buying a utensil set that lives in your purse instead of getting a plastic fork everywhere you go. Doing a little more planning around the food that we eat and being intentional about when we buy stuff so we know it won't go bad in the fridge. Like I'm really bad about not eating leftovers. So I've started to make like more decisions about not having a ton of extra food that's left over in the fridge that I'm probably going to waste. One day at a time of maybe taking public transportation instead of a car, or taking an extra beat to think about which piece of meat or which piece of produce I'm buying and asking a question of the person selling it and where it came from, how it was grown. And starting to be a little more curious about the decisions that we make in terms of purchasing. All in all, I think like the biggest thing that we've learned and that I like firmly believe and I don't think gets said enough is to be really patient with yourself. Like building new habits, it takes time, and behavior change comes from like tiny little steps that happen every day. So if you can do one little thing every day, that adds up to a lot. And making a mistake or using a plastic fork, it won't be the end of the world. It really won't.
And that's how we learn. We grow from those little mistakes and the little points that we mess up on. It's like, oh no, I forgot this or I forgot that. I'm gonna have to go with the disposable option. Okay, I won't do it next time.
Yeah.
Let's get better about it. We can do it.
And being just patient and forgiving with yourself and the time it takes to really build a new habit, and just trying to make those little choices every day that ultimately, if we all make like one tiny change every day, it adds up to a lot.
When it comes to like buying your stuff, do you guys source a lot of your vegetables and stuff from like local places and farmers markets and stuff to try and avoid some of the packaging? Or what about, from that side of things?
We do. I mean, we have the benefit of attending a few farmers markets, so we try and buy directly from the farmer whenever possible. That's great for both the economy and for the food that you're putting in your body. But, we're just like everyone else. We end up at the grocery store. We buy a box of something or a bag of pasta. We're human.
Mm-hmm.
But you can make those little changes.
I think we can, you can also encourage people to carry more sustainable options too, right? Because it's like, that's one of the things I'm like, why is all this stuff just so plastic wrapped?
The bell peppers always annoy me. The 3-pack of bell peppers that are plastic wrapped.
I go to like Home Depot and buy something and it's like wrapped in 3 levels of plastic. It's like the thing is wrapped in something and then the screws are individually wrapped in plastic. I'm like, oh my God, like really?
So one thing I've started doing at my house, my kids are so into art, like art projects. So it kind of makes me feel better. Toilet paper rolls, boxes, containers, jars, like the cold brew jar, anything that's a container, I put in a bag, and that goes into my kids' art drawer, and they make stuff out of everything, bottles, and then you're not buying like all the googly eyes and pipe cleaners and all that stuff that just is wasteful, and they're obsessed. Like they love everything. So that's kind of one fun way to.
If you do have kids at home, kids enjoy the composting practice and getting involved in that. And a few partner organizations here who do educational campaigns at elementary schools. And just these kids' faces light up when they're playing with compost and seeing how they can take this, what would be in a trash can and turn it back into this cool stuff they play with in their garden and their dirt.
Kids love dirt.
Yeah.
Kids love dirt.
Like kids love playing in dirt. And
you
also,
get your hands dirty.
Of course. And then I always find too that when my kids help prepare food with me, they're super open to tasting it and trying it. Whereas if something just appears on their plate that looks a little weird, it's like, what's that green thing? If they know they chopped up spinach or they like cut a tomato, I think it makes it more exciting to them. So yeah, like get your kids involved in all of this stuff. It's great.
And that helps build those practices young too. I know when I was a kid, they taught us recycling in school. And so now I like to recycle in my adult life, and that's part of my practice. But other people, they never learned about that, so they don't keep the cardboard out of the trash can for whatever reason.
Mm-hmm.
Well, also just jumping off that idea too, I think what I find like fun and empowering about like compost and food waste is in this huge thing of like climate change in our environment that feels totally overwhelming and disempowering, and you feel like one person, you can't do everything. You can actually like take a little bit of ownership over what's happening with your waste and create something that grows life out of it. And there's something super fun about that and like generative to me about feeling like I own this little part of my own impact and I can make something like really beautiful out of it instead of wasting it.
So, hot off the press, no, we have some fun social media questions that came in and we would love to ask you. One that I think was really good is, what was the big turning point in your life that caused you to start composting and start the composting business?
I think that would just be the fact that when we got out here, when we moved to Los Angeles, we were so ingrained with composting already. The fact that we couldn't do it as easily or there wasn't access to it, it just upset us too much. We're like, how do we make this happen? We need to make this happen. LA could really use a service like this. And we've just springboarded from there, just diving right into it and figuring out how we can do it and how we can make it more accessible for everyone.
What's the most exciting innovation in sustainability that you've seen recently?
Yeah, package-free restaurants. That seems to be a trend that's just starting now. A few restaurants where even the to-go containers, they're returnable. So you'd get a bit more rigid of a container. They fill it up with your takeout, you bring it home, and then you swap that container out when you come back. I know in other cities, there's salad places that offer that. You have this salad bowl that's reusable, dishwasher safe, and you can bring that in and out. So really reducing from the source the amount of trash that we create. It's been a great trend that's happening recently. In terms of product creation, a lot more companies are moving towards natural inputs or less harmful inputs and analyzing the way that they produce their materials and seeing how they're impacting the environment. And starting to look at the triple bottom line, as it's known in the business community.
I guess I get really energized by the amount of like excitement and effort that's really going into providing options that don't require a ton of plastics or packaging. So like bulk shopping opportunities, like refill stations, things like that, that really let you kind of decide what you want to put your purchases in instead of necessarily needing plastic bags or things like that.
And I feel like a lot of that comes from pressure put on by the consumer. And I think it's important to know that you have a voice and you can reach out to your local stores and just ask or, show your concern. And people, with enough pressure, I feel like companies do listen.
Oh, definitely. Vote with your money. Businesses respond to that. If you're buying more organic food in the grocery store, they're going to stock more organic food in the grocery store. If something's not selling well, they'll get rid of that. That's the nature of business. So if you want to see more sustainable items in the stores you visit, start purchasing with that and making that an intentional decision.
One more. What are 3 tips that I can apply to my own life as well as tell others on how they can start being more sustainable every day? We did touch on this, but if you had to choose just 3.
Containers. So bring your to-go coffee container with you. That is a great one. A lot of people need that. It's a little packaged up fork, spoon, knife, chopsticks if that's your preference, but they make a lot of great reusable kits like that are friendly to match with any style that you might have.
I would go back to like wasting less food. Try to like digging in a little bit about learning how to use more of each piece of produce you have or learning how to buy a little more intentionally or meal plans so that stuff isn't necessarily going bad in your fridge.
Really, when you're excited about something, which you guys are, now I'm excited about something, which now I want to tell my friends about it, and it becomes a whole chain.
You were excited when they walked in the door.
I've been excited for the whole month. I'm like, we have some really fun people coming in. It's just, I'm super into actually seeing something, thinking that's a cool idea, and actually following through and learning about it and educating myself. And I just think it's cool to find out about these things that can seem so daunting and so like, oh, well, I live near the beach. I'm not going to have like anyone can do these things. I think it's just finding, like you guys said, finding the right solution for your specific situation.
And there's plenty of resources out there. You mentioned a bunch. We'll have a ton more in the show notes.
Yeah, for sure.
We'll list out everything and all your recommendations and everything in the show notes. So if anybody wants any more information, they can find it right there. We want to thank you guys so much for taking the time to come in. I'm super helpful, super informative. I wish my wife were here because she's like really into composting right now, so I'll just have to make her listen to the episode. But I feel like she'd be your like best friend.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having us. It's been a great conversation with you guys, and we're always happy to answer questions via our email, and we're actively engaging in discussions with people from all around the community and how we can improve things.
So where can people find you if they want to talk to you?
Best point of contact would be through our website, epicrenewal.org, our Instagram handle at epic_renewal. And those are really our 2 sort of digital means of communication. Otherwise, we're around a few farmers markets and things like that if you happen to be in the LA area and want to meet us in person.
Well, we also want to take a quick second and say thank you to you guys for listening. And we encourage you to follow us on social media as well. You can find us at howtohome_guide on Instagram, or you can check out our website at howtohome.com.
Yeah, this show was actually a suggestion from one of our listeners through our Instagram. So we listen and we find the guests and we make it happen.
And we also want to say thank you to FilterBuy for making this series and this episode possible. So make sure you guys visit filterbuy.com to sign up for your HVAC filters. Anything else?
No, that's it. Thank you guys so much. I'm
you.
excited
Thank
to
you.
get my hands dirty.
Yeah.
And thank you to that lone listener who requested us. We
Yes.
appreciate it.
Well, thank you guys so much for listening, and we'll see you next time. The How To Home podcast is brought to you by FilterBuy.com, your one-stop direct-to-consumer replacement air filter brand, and is produced in collaboration by Amassed Media Group, LLC, and Intelligent Arts and Artists. The show is executive produced by George Ruiz and Aaron Massey.